Hello and welcome to our webinar. My name is Mark and I'm with the North American office of BitBrain here in Boston. Today we're going to talk about the Implicit Response Test, a scientific research method that has been employed for about 40 years by social psychologists and more recently by market researchers and brands as a way of analyzing non-conscious information about consumers' preferences and biases, information that cannot be acquired with more traditional tests or questionnaires. So this is probably not a surprise, but you are all biased, and so am I. Due to our past experiences, upbringing, and education, non-conscious bias affects our thoughts, helps define our beliefs, influences our attitudes, and shapes our behavior. It's the reason, for example, why many people associate the color black with elegance and red with passion when they are car shopping. However, it's also the reason why technology is still more associated with boys than with girls, or why, in part, biases still persist in hiring. Consumers, of course, are also highly affected by non-conscious associations, and these help explain brand perception and positioning of a brand in the consumer's mind, and therefore, they can help us predict purchasing preferences and shopping behavior. But how can we identify and measure something that is, by definition, non-conscious? Well, that's what an implicit response test does. It's also known as IRTs, or implicit bias tests. These are scientific techniques that are used to collect non-conscious information from research participants or consumers about hidden preferences toward things like brands, products, ads, politicians, public figures, and so on. Putting it simply, this is done by measuring the time that it takes an individual to classify those things by pre-selected concepts. We'll show that in a lot more detail coming up. There are, of course, other techniques to measure and quantify non-conscious data. BitBrain makes several devices that do exactly that, including systems for EEG, galvanic skin response, breathing rate, heart rate, and so on. But for this, the participants have to come in and physically wear sensors. IRTs, on the other hand, can be carried out via website. We can gather non-conscious data from hundreds of participants fully remotely with considerable logistical time and cost savings compared to these other neuromarketing techniques. IRT techniques are fairly well established in the academic world, and now market researchers are discovering the potential of these tests, and they're becoming a very popular tool for brands. Let's see how they work. IRTs are grounded in research as to how our brains process information, a phenomenon explained in part by something called the dual process theory. This is a way of differentiating between two distinct ways in which a thought can arise. The more familiar process and the slower process is called System 2, which corresponds to explicit reasoning and controlled thought. This is intentional thinking or aware thinking. The faster process is called System 1, and this corresponds to an automatic spread of activation in the brain, which operates very quickly but with limited conscious accessibility. For this, we are seeking to measure only System 1, the fast, non-conscious process. These are selected by carefully controlling the timing of the measured response. Responses that take too long are assumed to be part of System 2, driven by conscious thought, and then therefore eliminated from the analysis. One way to measure System 1, as we mentioned before, is by placing sensors on the body that record the very quick neurological or physiological response of the participant. However, System 1 reactions can also be measured without physiological sensors. How? This is where the IRT test comes in. It works by measuring and comparing a participant's reaction time while they classify a concept, like a logo or a brand or an image, into one of two predefined categories. When a stimulus event takes place, like let's say the presentation of an image on a screen, the participant's brain starts processing that information immediately. It takes between 200 to 300 milliseconds on the low end and 600 to 700 milliseconds on the high end to process that information and to react to it by, for example, pressing a key on a keyboard. All the responses that take longer than 700 milliseconds are considered contaminated by conscious decision-making and are therefore eliminated from our analysis. But within that established window of time, if the participant reacts quicker in classifying one particular concept, like a logo or a brand, into a category than another logo or brand, it is said that that relationship between that logo and the category is more familiar or inherent in the mind of the individual than the other. In other words, for this participant, that concept, that logo, brand, whatever, and the category are mentally associated. With a fast enough response, we know that the participant was not using system 2, the conscious and reflexive mind. The response could only have come from system 1, the non-conscious mind, and therefore it's an expression of bias. It's important to remember that IRTs are comparative tests. They compare two concepts like two brands, two advertisements, two commercials, two products, two public figures, etc. There are several different kinds of implicit response tests in the market, but there are three that we're going to focus on here as the most common, both in academics and in marketing. And those are the implicit association test, the semantic priming test, and the visual priming tests. The first of these, and the most classic, is the implicit association test. This is a test that, in general terms, determines which of two concepts are more positively perceived by a group of participants. The simplest example of this is to take a brand and that brand's competitor, run the implicit association test, and we can determine non-consciously whether a group of consumers perceives one or the other as the more positive brand. The next one we'll discuss is the semantic priming test, one of the most commonly used ones in marketing. In this case, the participant will also assign a brand or something into predefined categories, but now after viewing an attribute that works like a primer. So for example, the participant will see the word tasty or trustworthy or familiar and then have to categorize the concept. The speed of that classification helps determine the association for that participant between the thing they're categorizing, like a brand, and the attribute, like tasty or healthy. Finally, the visual priming test works the same way as the semantic priming test, but in this case, instead of using text as primers, we'll use images. This is widely used to test attributes that are a bit more abstract or that are more recognizable with an image than just using words. Now, to understand how these tests work in practice, we're going to see some real examples of each one. First one we'll discuss is the implicit association test. If you remember, the IAT is a comparative test that allows us to know which concept, like a brand, logo, public figure, whatever, is more positively perceived than another. For this specific example, appropriately enough for a European company, we're going to compare two soccer teams, Real Madrid and FC Barcelona, to determine which one is more positively perceived for a group of participants. There are two straightforward things we have to do to design an IAT test. The first thing we have to do is to select some images and or words that capture the two concepts that we're comparing. So in this case, we have some images and words that compare each of the two soccer teams. The second thing we have to do is to select two groups of words that are associated with positive or negative attributes. So things like superior, fantastic, annoying, mediocre. It should probably be noted that IAT tests can use two different categories, like say modern versus traditional or something like that. But the more straightforward or more common way to do this is just to use simply positive and negative, and then two groups of words that fit into each of those two categories. Once the test starts, the participant has to do one of two things. They're going to see something on the screen, and it's either going to be an image or a word that belongs into the category Barcelona or the category Real Madrid, or they're going to see a word that belongs in the category positive or the category negative. And in either case, they have to press the keyboard keys E and I to classify that thing very quickly into its category. So for example, if they suddenly see a picture of the Camp Nou Stadium in Barcelona, they have to press the I key to rank that as part of the Barcelona category. Or if they see the word excellent appears, they might have to press the E key to rank that into the positive category. Then the word mediocre appears, they press the key that goes into the negative category. The Real Madrid coach appears, they press the I key to put that into the Real Madrid category. Of course, in order to avoid biases, the location of all four of those potential categories is constantly randomly alternated in each block. So in the first block, Barcelona or positive may be grouped together on the left, and Madrid and negative are on the right. In the next block, it may be Barcelona and negative on the left, and Madrid and positive on the right, etc. Okay, so let's say that participant number one associates Real Madrid with positive attributes. When this participant is in block two, in which she has to classify Real Madrid with positive and Barcelona with negative, because this is a task that is coherent with her associations, she's going to respond faster and with fewer mistakes. Now, when this participant is in another block in which she has to classify Barcelona with positive or Real Madrid with negative, which is a task that is not coherent with her associations, the classification will be slower and will likely include more mistakes. What the test is measuring is the number of mistakes and the speed of classification in each block as a way of uncovering the implicit associations in the mind of a particular participant, and then, of course, aggregating this across multiple participants. The interpretation of the data is pretty easy. For this particular group of participants, these are the results we've obtained. The two bars correspond to the two concepts we've compared, Real Madrid and FC Barcelona, and the aggregate response time for classifying attributes into the category positive. The shorter bar indicates a faster classification and therefore a stronger association of this attribute with the category. According to these results and this group of participants, probably a bunch of people who live in Madrid, there's a greater association between Real Madrid and positive than with Barcelona and positive. What's interesting is not that it reveals that a big fan of Real Madrid actually likes Real Madrid, because we can determine that just by asking, but this shows the unconscious association for the participants regardless of their conscious preferences. A soccer rivalry makes for a good example, but the IAT test can be applied to compare two of almost anything: brands, packaging, political figures, etc. IAT is the classic implicit test, and it's the one that's been used for many years by the academic community. However, it is not the most frequently used one in market research. That would actually be the semantic priming test, and here we provide another example. The IAT test we discussed previously is limited to two concepts or attributes. However, semantic priming allows us to choose up to 8. So by way of example, we're going to compare multiple attributes, in this case professional careers, and determine which ones are more associated with men or women. This is why priming tests are more common in market research, because you can compare two different brands or products according to a number of different attributes within the same test. So to set up this test, we're going to define two images that clearly represent the two concepts we're comparing, in this case male and female, and then we're going to choose several attributes that we're interested in comparing in those two concepts. In this case, it's going to be engineering, math, business, nursing, and education. The test has 4 blocks. 2 of these are familiarization blocks used so that the participants get used to the dynamic of the test. For the first one, the participant has to classify our pink or blue images into men by pressing E and women by pressing I. And from familiarization block 2, it's the other way around: men I and women E. Next, we have the evaluation blocks, or priming blocks. The participant has to do the same thing, classify the images into men or women using the E or I keys. But in this case, before the pink or blue picture appears, one attribute will randomly pop up first as a priming stimuli. For example, the priming stimuli engineering will appear. The participant doesn't have to do anything but read it, but then the image for men appears, and the participant has to quickly classify it into men or women. In block 2, the same routine happens, but with the position swapped. By alternating the location of women and men, we can make sure that there are no biases based on the position alone that could affect the results. So if a particular participant inherently associates engineering and men, what would happen? Well, our brain always tries to anticipate what's going to happen in the future. When engineering pops up non consciously, this participant is going to anticipate what's next, and to some extent is going to be waiting for men to appear. If men appears, he or she will be faster and make fewer mistakes in the classification due to the fact that this association already exists in his or her mind. But if the woman symbol appears for this particular participant, the classification will be slower and more likely to include mistakes, as it is not coherent with the participant's existing associations. We have to point out that this one time doesn't really mean anything. These trials are repeated many times with the attributes fully randomized before we can prove or disprove an association. Okay, so if we look at the data, the results look like this. What we see in the graph is the difference in reaction time when engineering appeared when the participants had to classify it between men and women. Also listed are other attributes: math, business, nursing, and education. The results show that after engineering appears, men was selected much faster. For the sample group, there's a much stronger association between men and engineering than there is between women and engineering. Likewise, we can see a strong association between nursing and women as opposed to men. The test not only reveals the existence of an automatic association or hidden bias, prejudice, etc., but also the strength of these associations. To turn this into a market research example, just imagine that instead of women and men, we chose a brand and its competitor. And instead of these professions, we chose attributes that we want to analyze for those two. So, for example, modern, natural, traditional, trustworthy, elegant, durable, etc. These results would help us understand how those attributes are unconsciously associated with the brand and competitor we're trying to study. The last example we're going to show you is the visual priming test, which is fairly similar to the last one. For our example, we're going to start with a list of famous athletes, and we're going to test the association with two different brands. And since this is the visual priming test, in this case, instead of choosing a list of words or attributes, we're going to pick images of each of these players. So the process is pretty much the same as in the last test. First, we're going to have two blocks for familiarization, just to get the participant used to how this works. And then we're going to have two blocks of priming test, where the participant has to classify the Nike or Adidas logo into two categories, Nike or Adidas. Only in this case, the priming image or the priming stimuli is going to be an image of our athletes. So if Paul Gasol is associated with Adidas, the priming effect will take place, and when his picture appears, the participant will automatically anticipate the next step and will be um, subconsciously ready to classify the Adidas logo into the Adidas group. So if we look at the results, in this case, after Paul Gasol appeared, Adidas was classified much faster. So there's a much stronger association between Gasol and Adidas than Nike, and also it was a much stronger association than our other three athletes with any of their brands. So to summarize, all three of these tests measure the implicit association in participants' minds and the strength of those associations. They do this by measuring the response time and the errors that are made when a participant is asked to classify content. So next we're going to discuss a little bit how IRTs are applied in market research. So the most straightforward example of this is just called simple protocol, which is a single application of one of our three IRT tests used as a basic comparison. So the most obvious example is comparing a brand with its main competitor, either to see which one is more positively perceived or to determine which one is associated with a particular attribute. Simple protocol can also be used to analyze changes. So, for example, if a brand wants to change a logo or a package design, but they want to be careful not to lose familiarity or an association with particular attributes, they can compare the new logo to the old one, for example, with a priming test. Another way to use simple protocol is to test an advertising claim. So you can do a comparative test to see if a particular claim better transmits attributes than another. Another protocol we can consider is called a pre-post protocol. This is designed to test how a particular marketing material or a customer experience, like a website, a shopping experience, a TV commercial, or whatever, may change association or biases in the consumers. Incidentally, in the lab, pre and post tests are sometimes reinforced with physiological data like GSR, eye tracking, or EEG. To set up this kind of test, first we need to design a test where we compare a brand against a competitor to define a starting point or a baseline. This can be any one of the IRT tests. For this example, we could say semantic priming with a series of attributes that interest us. Then the participant is exposed to the materials or experience that we're interested in. So they watch a TV commercial, they walk through a store, browse a website, etc. The IRT test is then repeated as a post test. And by comparing the pre and post results, we can measure what effect, if any, the customer's experience had on non conscious association. So if we see that there was no change in the results, then the experience didn't have an effect on brand positioning. But if there are changes, we can determine the effect that the material or experience had on the participant and whether this effect was positive or negative. So you can see with a pre and post test, the thing being evaluated is actually the media or experience in the middle. So the commercial, website, event, in store experience, or whatever that the participant is exposed to between the initial test and the post test. So these tests are widely used in branding studies to determine the effect that a particular marketing strategy may have, for better or for worse, on perception that consumers have about a brand. IRTs can be performed online and alone, which is particularly convenient right now. However, when you complement these implicit methods with other neuromarketing techniques such as EEG, GSR, BVP, eye tracking, and so on, it permits you to have a more comprehensive understanding of what's going on in the participant's mind and thus create a better prediction of consumer behavior. If you're interested in acquiring an implicit response test platform to start making these kinds of online tests, you can always upgrade this later by adding sensors when you're ready to grow your capabilities. So these online tests are a good start, especially at the moment when it's difficult to bring participants into a laboratory. However, when normal participant recruitment resumes, you can expand your capabilities to complement implicit information with other metrics that are obtained with biosensors, adding metrics such as engagement, emotional activation, impact, workload, visual attention, memorization, and emotional valence. So, to finish things up, we're going to go through some frequently asked questions. Number one, how long does it take a participant to complete the test? IRT should take no more than 10 minutes or so. If it's much longer than that, then fatigue and lack of concentration start to become factors in your test. That's one reason why there's a limit on the number of attributes that can be defined. It's to just limit the duration of the test itself. Number two, what about participants that have a higher response time, like older individuals? To some extent, tests can be adapted to the participant population with some adaptations of the algorithm that they use. Number three, can they be combined with traditional surveys? Yes, that's actually pretty much recommended just to gain data on how the conscious and non conscious reactions might be different. You can link IRTs to questionnaires, focus group discussions, and all the more traditional ways of gaining conscious information. Number four, can they be done in person? Yes, as a matter of fact, that's actually fairly common with the pre and post protocol. Because in that case, you can control this intermediate experience between the initial test and the post test, and it also allows you to evaluate that information with EEG, GSR, BVP, eye tracking, and things like that. It's often done in house where the entire process can be controlled. Number five, what are the differences in optimization of online IRTs compared to face-to-face IRTs? So this depends a bit on the size of the sample and the kind of participants you're recruiting. But of course, the main advantage of doing these tests online is that they can be done in parallel. So many participants can take the test at the same time, whereas if you're bringing people in, probably you're only doing a few at a time. The process itself is fairly similar in either case. Number 6, how do we know the participant is focusing on the test? Well, that's all about timing. So we only measure the responses that happen in a very specific window of time. So if you respond too quickly or too slowly, those responses are automatically excluded from the analysis, which would absolutely exclude somebody who's not paying close attention. And number 7, how can I try an implicit answer test? We have a free IRT platform set up for you to try at www.bitbrain.com/IRT. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. If you want to learn more about implicit response tests, or if you're interested in a demo or have any other questions, please don't hesitate to email us. Our address is info@bitbrain.com.